Alright, well welcome to the latest Q&A video session for early 2019, as promised. I mentioned at the end of the last one in October that I plan to do this one around now. So here it is. Thanks to everyone that sent in their questions. There's been loads of them, which have been received via YouTube, Facebook, email, various other means. I'm going to attempt to get through as many of those as I can today. By necessity, my responses are going to have to be brief and quick fire. Otherwise, this video runs the risk of being about 6 hours long, and nobody wants that, right? I'm not going to be able to address every single question I've been sent because some of them were very deep and complex and searching, and it's going to take quite a degree of time and resource to really get to the bottom of certain subjects and certain topics that I've been asked to address. So the ones I'll be talking about today are largely based on information that I'm able to retain in my severely overworked brain and little nuggets here and there that I've had access to. I've not had the time to do book style research into any of these subjects simply because I've just got so many goddamn things going on. You know, I've got a family life, I've got a personal life on top of all the other stuff that I do. I do hold down a day job. This shit doesn't pay, despite what some might tell you. So I'm just trying to get as much of it done and crammed into my overworked schedule as possible. So this actually brings up another point which I'll address here. Without any exaggeration, I receive messages literally every single day from people saying, have you looked into such and such a group? What can you tell me about such and such a musician? Have you studied this particular scene, this fad, this trend, this movement in terms of what more there is to know? And I know many other researchers that do this kind of work get the same thing because I talk to them about it. It's great that people are questioning the official version of everything these days. It's great that people understand that the entertainment industry is a little bit more than just some fun and there's much more to know. But what seems to be happening more and more is the small number of researchers that are doing this kind of work, such as myself and others, are getting more and more dumped on us from people saying, you should look into this, why don't you look into that, what do you know about this? What we need more of is people getting in touch to say, I decided that somebody should look into this particular social movement. Somebody needed to study the esoteric occult symbolism involved with this group. And so I've done it. Here's what I've found out. Here's the information that I want to bring to the table to share with everyone else. This is what we need. A wider community of citizen researchers doing this style of work. And most of the stuff that I dig up and many other researchers is there in the public domain. You don't need to go to obscure libraries and dig through archives and records to get this information. It's all available online. Obviously, you have to be wary about just going to Wikipedia because that site is controlled, but there's many other resources that you can go to online to piece together different aspects of certain stories. And it's amazing how quickly the trends and the patterns emerge and how much you can deduce and intuit when you start doing this style of research. So anyone can do that. And then in terms of sharing the information with others and aiding the understanding of people that have already gone a certain way down these paths, anyone can do that as well. Anyone can start a YouTube channel for free. If you get shut down on YouTube, there's other options available to you. Anyone can get a blogspot site for free. You can start doing a podcast on a platform like Podomatic or Spreaker for very little cost. So there's all kinds of ways that anyone can share this sort of information. You don't need letters after your name. You don't need any special kind of qualifications. In fact, it's best if you don't have those things. If you're just a regular member of society, it's incredible what we together can all dig up to aid our collective understanding of what's been right there in front of our noses for so long. All right, so that having been said, small rant out of the way, let's get into it. Let's see what we've got. So the first one I'm going to address here, I've got my trusty clipboard because I'm old school like that, I'm a Luddite like that, and I'm proud. Zoe Evans on Gmail got in touch to say, Just wondering what your feelings are on the Kurt Cobain murder. Note the loaded question. Particularly as Courtney Love's former son-in-law is suing Sam Lutfi and her for attempting to have him murdered and make it look like suicide. Alright, so according to reports from May of 2018, Courtney Love's former son-in-law alleges she tried to have him killed in order to get Kurt Cobain's guitar back, according to legal documents. Isaiah Silver, who was married to Frances Bean Cobain, the only child of Courtney Love and Kurt Cobain, is suing a number of people, including Courtney Love, her manager Sam Lutfi, actor Ross Butler, private investigator John Nazarian, and musician Michael Schenk. He claims they conspired to murder him in a bid to recover a famous guitar once belonging to Cobain. Silver alleges the group are guilty of burglary, robbery, sexual battery, kidnapping, attempted murder, criminal threats, false imprisonment, extortion, stalking, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and trespass. Just another day at the office then, in other words. So, Courtney Love, first of all, it's well known, is the daughter of Hank Harrison, who early on in his career was a road manager for the Grateful Dead, who are known to be assets of the CIA. They had all kinds of links into the Bohemian Club, Skull and Bones, or other aspects of the establishment. So that's who she is, and that's where she came from. Sam Lutfi, who's named in this story, has previous with industry shenanigans too. As I reported in Musical Truth Volume 1, he for a time was Britney Spears' personal manager, and he brought a lawsuit against Britney's mother, citing breach of contract, libel and defamation. Britney's mother, Lynn Spears, had blamed Lutfi for her daughter's famous breakdown, which incorporated her famous head-shaving incident. The breakdown saw Britney losing custody of her two children to dancer Kevin K-Fed Federline. Lutfi's lawsuit was thrown out, and Britney's family obtained a restraining order against him alongside her ex-boyfriend Adnan Ghalib and attorney John Eardley. The order forbade all three from contacting Britney or coming within 250 yards of her property or family members. So it would appear that Sam Lutfi was rather more than just a personal manager in terms of the influence and the sway that he held over Britney. And this to me is the classic case of a mind control subject and her handler. And it's interesting how these people just crop up in different scenarios involving different artists. So the Britney Spears episode having been over, he then emerges caught up in this whole Courtney Love, Kurt Cobain mess. Now, I can't say for certain what happened to Kurt Cobain, but it certainly would appear that he was murdered. It certainly doesn't seem like suicide to me. We've got the fact that he died at the age of 27, so there's the whole 27 Club aspect. Courtney Love's family background has to come in for some questioning with all the CIA links that you have there. And when you get into her bloodline, it's not just Hank Harrison, her father, who becomes of interest. You discover that she's a distant cousin of Douglas Fairbanks Jr., a famous actor and a decorated naval officer. And that is far from the first link we're going to encounter in this video to military backgrounds. They're all over the bloody place, as anyone that follows this style of work will already know, but we're going to see many examples. In his book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, investigative journalist John Potash, who I interviewed a couple of years ago, writes of how Courtney Love brought large quantities of heroin and other narcotics over to Ireland and England and distributed them among various music scenes there in the 1990s, with apparent impunity from any law enforcement. Any regular person distributing that amount of stuff into these scenes would doubtless have been arrested, but she seemed to be above the law. Then we have the 2015 docudrama directed by Benjamin Statler called Soaked in Bleach. This is worth watching for some further insights into this, because he is postulating in that documentary that Courtney Love was complicit in Kurt Cobain being murdered, because that's what it was. We have the story that on the 17th of June 2015, Deadline Hollywood reported that Courtney Love had sent a cease and desist letter against theatres that were showing this movie soaked in bleach, claiming a false accusation of criminal behaviour is defamatory, which entitles Ms. Cobain, Love, to both actual and presumed damages. But to date, no lawsuit has been filed on Courtney Love's behalf, so it would appear to have been a whole load of talk. All right, let's move on to a question from my dude, Frode Hagen, Frosthound from Norway, posed via email. So he asked, do artists select what goes on the cover of albums and in the sleeves, or do the record companies decide? So this is a good question. Excuse me while I take a sip of coffee. Keep calm and carry on, right? Something like that. So, record sleeve images were far more influential during the vinyl era than they are now, when most people get their music in electronic form, downloaded MP3s and such. You may get a cover image that comes with a downloaded album, but I would suggest few people really look at it, and nobody really thinks to scrutinise it in the way vinyl album sleeves used to. It used to be almost as exciting to get an incredibly complex sleeve when you went out to buy a record as it did to get the album itself. And many of these sleeves, of course, have been endlessly analysed for symbolism and hidden clues. Think of the likes of Sgt. Pepper and Abbey Road, and many of the Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd sleeves, for example. On that note, you used to get agencies like Hypnosis. There was this company, Hypnosis, as in Gnosis, Gnosis, and they designed album sleeves for a huge array of A-list groups, such as Pink Floyd, T-Rex, Black Sabbath, UFO, 10cc, Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, The Scorpions, Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Def Leppard, Paul McCartney, which one, and Wings, and so many others. So this company was run by Storm Thorgerson, who it turns out was at school in Cambridge with Syd Barrett and Roger Waters of Pink Floyd. Interesting link. Also Aubrey Powell and a guy called Peter Christopherson, who was an associate of Genesis P. Orridge, this deeply sick individual that was part of Psychic TV, Throbbing Gristle, and has a whole load of other stuff going on in his backstory as well. Peter Christopherson died in his sleep at the age of 55 in 2010 in unknown circumstances. And as we go on in this video, we're going to meet a bunch of other artists who died in their 50s very suddenly from some very mysterious causes. I would suspect that there are layers to this then. So some of the more high-ranking musicians in the industry, largely by way of their family links, would probably have a major say in the imagery that goes into the artwork of their albums. But then you'll have other artists who would very much be at the mercy of the record companies and the production companies involved, and they would have their record sleeves designed for them with no input whatsoever. A question which has always occurred to me is whether the rapper Jeru the Damager was aware of the fact that his 1994 album The Sun Rises in the East carried a depiction of what was going to happen on 9/11, September 11th, 2001, when that album came out in 1994, 7 years earlier. What you have is a picture of Jeru, and in the background you've got the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center exploding in exactly the way we were shown on September 11th. There are many other sleeves, of course, which depict this. But my question is, was Jeru complicit in this? Because if he was, it would suggest that he had some kind of prior knowledge of what was going to happen, and that flies in the face of his profile as an artist, which is as a conscious rapper who very much has gone against the mainstream way of doing things. He's gone against the grain, he's been rebellious, he's been outspoken, he's not towed the industry line. So this becomes a question with many artists. Another famous 9/11 sleeve, of course, was Breakfast in America by Supertramp, which has been endlessly analysed, which seems to depict aspects of 9/11 when a mirror image reversal is made of it. That particular sleeve was designed by a dude called Mike Dowd, and he won a Grammy for that work in 1979. The question here then becomes, did Supertramp know what that album depicted? Or did Mike Dowd go ahead and devise it without any kind of input from the group? I don't know the answer to that. But then when you get on to the likes of the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper and Abbey Road, I would suggest that absolutely members of those groups would be in full knowledge of what was going to be communicated via those album sleeves. Of course, it wasn't they themselves who devised it. Peter Blake famously put together the Sgt. Pepper one, and there would have been other parties involved as well. But I would suggest that groups of that ilk know damn well what's going on with their artwork, whereas others don't. All right, let's see what's next. And I feel a bit like Noel Edmonds on Swap Shop back in the day here, going through letters. That shows my age, right, for any 1970s and 80s kids that remember that. Well, it's better that than Jimmy Savile on Jim'll Fix It, right? Now then, I've got a letter here from a young lady. No, that's enough of that. Don't feel right doing that. Okay, so this one comes from Bro Brian, posed via YouTube. He says, I've always been curious as to what really went on with the whole David Gilmour-Kate Bush connection. I don't buy the accepted story at all for 1 minute that he just happened to innocently scout her out and forward her to EMI. Was David a type of handler for Kate? Did he know her from a child? Or was it just a fabricated fairy tale story to sell to the media to make it all look legitimate, and the two were just told to play along at the request of their superiors a level above them both? Another good question. So it's been suggested that Dave Gilmour and Kate Bush were lovers for a time. So it's a little bit more than him just happening to discover her as an artist. Gilmour is from the aristocracy, the peerage. When you look into his bloodline backgrounds, becoming a rock star is not a natural career path for somebody of his breeding and his, aristocratic background. Unless his role is a little bit more than just a guitarist and a singer-songwriter in a rock group. Unless he's doing a little bit more by way of his real work. Miles Mathis, the researcher who comes up with a lot of contentious and challenging stuff, and I certainly don't go along with everything that he says, but I do think he raises some interesting points from time to time. In an article that he put out, he alleges that Gilmour somehow outranks Roger Waters in the aristocracy, hence the source of many arguments between them, and this would explain the fact that Dave Gilmour has a CBE, Commander of the British Empire, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, which is the highest ranking of OBEs, MBEs and CBEs, and Roger Waters has no honours. There could be something to that. I've got a lot of notes on Pink Floyd from Martin Brown, a very knowledgeable guy that's been in touch by email, and he's brought a whole load of this stuff across my radar. He said in an email, the fact that all of Pink Floyd ended up in a rock band seems really weird. They're also very posh. Nick Mason is Nick Barclay Mason. His father was Barclay Rowland Hill Mason. And he says, I've found no genealogical links, but the Barclay family are aristocratic, and Rowland Hill was one of Wellington's generals who became Lord Hill. Rick Wright of Pink Floyd is also super posh. He went to Haberdashers' Aske's School in London before the Regent Street Poly. Also, you would expect these guys to go to university, surely, perhaps even Cambridge, rather than a polytechnic, which was very much second-rung higher education in those days. So, yeah, we're back to the question of whether guys of that kind of background could naturally be expected to spend their entire careers in a rock band versus more conventional kind of career paths which await people with this sort of educational background. As I say, these are far from isolated examples in the music business. Kate Bush's father was a doctor of some variety or other. So All the biographies mention that he was a doctor, but we don't get to find out what kind of doctor he was. We can hazard a guess as to the nature of his work. But then, of course, we have Kate being awarded the high-ranking CBE as well. And that has to be suspicious. It does to my mind anyway. We also have a message here from Jean-Paul Goyce, who got in touch with me to say, back in the 80s, and probably still today, anybody in psychology attempting a PhD looking into the work of Wilhelm Reich. So Kate Bush famously put out the song and the video Cloudbusting in 1985 from her Hounds of Love album. And this depicted the work of Wilhelm Reich into orgone energy technology, seen from the perspective of his son Peter. And Kate plays the role of Wilhelm Reich's son in the video. So this guy says anyone putting out that kind of material and highlighting the work of Reich, which has been largely suppressed and stolen, was unlikely to get funding or support. Yet here's Kate Bush on the Geffen record label, achieved via Peter Gabriel, another associate, through Warner Brothers, shouting it from the rooftops. So it's going to be a whole bunch of people who have become aware of the work of Wilhelm Reich through Kate Bush putting it out there, who might not otherwise have been familiar with this guy in any way. And Warner Brothers, the final label of John Lennon, Kurt Cobain and Sid Vicious, etc. before their deaths, put this material out. And just to add, says this guy, Peter Gabriel's father was an electrical engineer with numerous patents, and his father-in-law was the Queen's private secretary. It also turns out that Peter Gabriel came from a very privileged background. His great-great-uncle, Sir Thomas Gabriel, another Sir, first baronet, was a Lord Mayor of London from 1866 to 1877. So we're supposed to believe that Peter Gabriel just came out of nowhere and decided that he wanted to join a rock band, and that's what he wanted to do with his life when he comes from that kind of ancestry, that kind of background. Of course, the odd individual may well slip through the net that has that kind of background, and they may choose to go a very unconventional route. But when you see it happening time and time and time and time again, and you have endless examples of people from these kind of backgrounds ending up as influential musicians, and they're always the prominent ones, they're always the A-listers, they're always the ones that people get to hear of, then you have to ask yourself if there's more to it than meets the eye. Another example when it comes to Lord Mayors would be Chris Martin of Coldplay. Turns out his grandfather, John Besley Martin, CBE, don't you know, was also a high sheriff, and he was the mayor in 1968 of the town of Exeter in Devon, just up the road from Tavistock, incidentally. Excuse the coffee. All right, can't remember who sent this one. I don't have a note of the sender, but the question is, Mark, have a look at Tommy, the rock opera or the film performance. I'd love to hear what you think of these films. Maybe some hidden stuff in there. And lots of not so hidden stuff as well, it would appear. So I saw the 1975 movie of Tommy, directed by Ken Russell, based on the Who musical. Ken Russell himself was in the RAF and the Merchant Navy, would you believe? The narrative of the movie blatantly depicts trauma-based mind control, seen from the perspective of Roger Daltrey, who plays the character Tommy. So this character's father is a military man, played by Robert Powell in the movie. He's supposedly killed in action, although he later reappears. You have Keith Moon, the drummer with The Who, playing Uncle Ernie in this film, who babysits, and he's an obvious paedophile. It's not even hinted at, it's just made very clear that that's what he's all about. There's mirror imagery everywhere, and this is all connected into mind control programming. There's one scene where a mirror smashes and the Tommy character snaps back into full consciousness. So what's supposed to have made him deaf, dumb and blind in the lyrics of Pinball Wizard, the famous song, is the fact that he's been subjected to this horrific traumatic abuse in early childhood. But he breaks through it. There's references in the movie to LSD connected to mind control as well. And it strikes me that the Who's famous song, Who Are You, would be a very relevant question to ask in this regard, with regards to the entire group. Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill did one of their Unspun shows on The Who, where they asked that question, and they went into aspects of that group coming out of the world of military intelligence. That's episode 44 of Unspun, if you want to go and dig that one out online. Plenty of truth in plain sight, disguised as entertainment, I would suggest, when it comes to this movie. They're telling us what goes on. You got the military links, you got the depictions of trauma-based mind control, and so we can't make the claim that we weren't in some way told by this group and this director, who would seemingly be in positions to understand how all this stuff goes down. Right, next one. Irene Ahmadi by email. She put a question in last time, and she's back with 3 questions actually here. So let's try and whiz through these. She asks, are you familiar with a web page called Farmers of Perception? You can find it by doing a search for Farmers of Perception WordPress, and it should come up. She says this site deals with the topic of celebrities faking their deaths to take on new identities or dual roles. Among them is singer Jeff Buckley. His death from a drowning in 1997 was shocking, she says. Shady circumstances to say the least. He was a great singer with so much promise. There's a singer now named Andrew Bird. This webpage points out similarities between the two. I'd like to know your view on these 2 singers and others who are said to have faked their deaths. So this site seems to be similar to the stuff that's put out by this guy Ed Sciarrini, otherwise known as Dallas Goldbug. And he's all about famous people supposedly reinventing themselves as other people in the public eye after faking their deaths. So this seems to be the origin of the idea that Bill Hicks somehow faked his death and became Alex Jones. And then you get all these other claims like Morgan Freeman is supposed to be Jimi Hendrix. Jim Morrison is supposed to have reinvented himself as Rush Limbaugh. What are some of the others? Bill Cooper is supposed to have become Jordan Maxwell. I don't place a lot of stock in this stuff myself. The verifiable evidence here is sorely lacking, and we need this to be able to place any kind of credibility on these claims. It seems to me like there's a whole cottage industry which has now emerged involving people making these wild claims. It's become very popular for YouTubers to claim that such and such an individual became somebody else. I feel the same way about all the claims that celebrities are really transgendered and they're all the opposite sex to the way they're presented to us. These claims require evidence and proof in order for them to stand up to scrutiny in any kind of way. And to my mind, this is very much lacking in a lot of the claims that we get. And so it is with the idea that these musicians fake their deaths somehow and become somebody else. I'm not saying that it's impossible for artists to fake their deaths, and there's a few that I believe did just that. I don't accept that Jim Morrison died in 1971, for example, the way we're told he did at the age of 27. I've got serious doubts about the official story of Elvis Presley dying in 1977, just by way of a couple of examples. But when it comes to these artists reinventing themselves and becoming somebody else, I require some more proof before I'm going to be able to nail my colours to that particular mast. Another question from Irene then would be, along those lines, another strange death was Def Leppard's Steve Clark. Like Jeff Buckley, he also died at age 30. He fell downstairs in his home and hurt his back. He got painkillers from a doctor and mixed them with alcohol, which resulted in his death. His girlfriend Janie found him dead on his couch. Shortly after his death, it was reported that she would have parties at his home. After his death, the band would talk about Steve's drinking problem in interviews. Years before, Rick Allen lost his arm in a car accident. He reported guys in another car bothering him, trying to force him off the road. Do you think they were trying to sacrifice Rick and later Steve? This is the theory that part of being famous is that you have to sacrifice someone. His girlfriend died a few years later, not sure of the cause of death. Well, absolutely, it would appear that blood sacrifices are a very real thing in the entertainment industry. There are a number of close relatives and personal friends of people that have gone on to become very successful and very influential who have died in very mysterious circumstances. In particular, mothers of prominent music artists do have a tendency of passing away very unexpected in some strange circumstances. So I do accept that that is a thing. It becomes interesting, this whole aspect of girlfriends, partners discovering these artists dead. It puts me in mind again of Jim Morrison, the situation with Pamela Courson, his girlfriend, who is said to have discovered his body unconscious in the bathtub in the apartment in Paris, and then she alerted the authorities, although seemingly nobody ever saw the body. When the police arrived, reportedly the body was already in a sealed casket, and there was no way of verifying if Jim had actually died, which is part of what gives me my doubts. Anyway, Pamela Courson, played by Meg Ryan in the Oliver Stone directed movie The Doors, which came out in 1990, starring Val Kilmer as Jim, died herself in 1974 of an apparent overdose, so she didn't last too long beyond Jim. Then we have Jimi Hendrix, who died in London in September 1970, seemingly at the hands of his manager, who was a military intelligence operative by the name of Mike Jeffrey. Jimmy's girlfriend, Monica Danneman, who was with him at the time, herself died 20-odd years later in 1996, when her body was discovered in a fume-filled car inside her garage at her home. So it seems there's a bit of housekeeping going on here, few loose ends being tidied up. These girlfriends who happen to discover these bodies, we're told, don't stick around for too long themselves. I'm also reminded of Courtney Love and Kurt Cobain, again of course, but Courtney would appear to be too much of an asset to be got rid of on a whim. Hence, she's still around and still making the headlines. Right, the third question from Irene then before we move on. Someone on YouTube has asked you about Joe Strummer of The Clash. I found his death surprising as well. I'd seen him in concert a few years before his death. He appeared to have died of heart failure. It seemed so sudden. He looked active and healthy. Any insight as to what may have happened? And there was another question on Joe Strummer from a guy called David White, who got in touch to say, did Joe Strummer die a natural death? I know he was said to have had an undiagnosed heart condition, but he was a pretty fit bloke. Not really expecting anything nefarious, but would like to know what you think. So, Joe Strummer was really John Graham Mellor. His real name was John Graham Mellor. His father's job becomes interesting. Ronald Ralph Mellor, who lived from 1916 to 1984 and was an MBE, member of the Order of the British Empire, part of the establishment, in other words. He was a clerical officer, later attaining the rank of Second Secretary in the Foreign Service on behalf of the British government. So Strummer, or John Mellor, was born in Turkey, and he went to boarding school at the City of London Freemen's School, CLFS, funded by the Corporation of the City of London, before he went on to join a punk new wave band. You know, like you do. Natural career progression, right? So that question emerges again. Would you expect somebody coming out of that kind of background to end up as an influencer of culture unless that role was prepared for him, and unless there were other parties who had an interest in the prominent punk and new wave bands, just thinking about this scene in particular, being headed up by tried and trusted individuals, rather than it being left to chance as to who became the leaders of that scene. In the last video, I talked a bit about John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, and the connections there to the House of Commons. He used to attend kinky sex parties there, apparently, according to his own admission. There's the affiliation with Malcolm McLaren, of course. And we have the manager of The Clash, Bernie Rhodes, who apparently, reportedly, introduced Johnny Rotten to Malcolm McLaren. And both Bernie Rhodes and Malcolm McLaren were stated situationists, which was this kind of intellectual, avant-garde, cultural sort of movement that very much dictated the ethos of the whole punk scene coming out of London. Another situationist was Tony Wilson of the Factory Records empire up in Manchester, responsible for the Hacienda and New Order, Joy Division, Happy Mondays and such. Another highly influential character from, I think, a public school background and a television presenter on Granada TV. Lots to know about him. In fact, in the next video, I think I'm going to have to go into detail into that whole Factory Records empire and all those Manchester connections, because there's much more to dig into there. Anyway, Joe Strummer died suddenly on the 22nd of December, the day after the winter solstice, in 2002 in his home of Broomfield in Somerset, and it was said to be the result of an undiagnosed congenital heart defect at the age of 50. This news puts me in mind of a few other individuals. One of them is Robert Palmer, the singer most famous for the song Addicted to Love. He turns out to have been the son of a British naval intelligence officer. And he died from a heart attack in a Paris hotel room. Not the first time Paris has cropped up, and far from the first time death by hotel room has cropped up either. On the 26th of September 2003, age 54. We then have Pete Burns of Dead or Alive. Mainly dead now, it would seem. He was the son of a British Army soldier. Is it just me, or is there a trend emerging here? Pete Burns died following a sudden cardiac arrest on the 23rd of October 2016 at the age of 57. And another one, consulting my notes, Steve Strange of the group Visage, very much an influential figure in the whole new romantic scene, the Blitz Club and all this coming out of London in the early 1980s. He, it turns out, would you believe, you might want to sit down, could be a shock, was the son of a British Army paratrooper. Steve Strange died on the 12th of February 2015, having suffered a heart attack while in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, at the age of 55. And one other character springs to mind here, which would be Frank Zappa, coming out of that whole Laurel Canyon scene. He was the son of an American defense engineer working on behalf of the US military-industrial complex, as has been well documented, and Frank Zappa died at the age of 52 after a long battle with prostate cancer on the 4th of December 1993. So what is going on with all these famous musicians, all of whom had fathers in the military in some capacity or other, all dying in their 50s, way before their time? I'll leave the question for people to ponder on for themselves, but for me it seems a little bit strange. Moving on then to Stephen Brammer. Before that, important business. It's cold now. How long have we been going? 38 minutes. Wow. Okay. So Stephen Brammer says, "This is something that just crosses my mind, and I wonder if you ever feel this. As much as modern culture is being spoon-fed by musicians and military and Freemasonry, is it a bad thing? I mean, The Doors, amazing. David Bowie, obviously an occultist, but amazing nonetheless. Freddie Mercury, same way. At any point, do you think that these people are actually doing the good work?" Well, I know what you mean. I understand what you're getting at, because it seems that the most obviously controlled musicians make the best goddamn music out there. You think of the likes of the Doors that you mentioned, David Bowie, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, so many of these groups. The music is incredible. And you have to ask yourself, if these groups didn't have the kind of financial backing and the kind of clout behind them that it would appear they did, in other words, input from social engineering, from the likes of the Tavistock Institute, military intelligence, the military industrial complex, would their music have been quite as incredible and quite as impactful and quite as well produced as it was? You know, if the financial input was lacking for a start. And it's a point of contention because many people, when they look at the sort of work that I put out and that many other authors and researchers have, highlighting the backgrounds of many of these groups, where they come from, what the agenda probably is behind them having been ushered into these influential positions, a lot of these people will say, well, when you come to an understanding of this, you really should throw out the entire body of their work. Don't listen to these albums again. Don't go to their shows. Don't support them in any way, because it can be seen that they're doing harm. And I get that. I understand the effect that these groups can be having on culture and on societal attitudes. I talk about it all the bloody time. But it becomes a matter of personal choice. You could opt to throw all this stuff out. You could opt to never listen to music again. You could opt to never go and see a movie in the cinema again on the grounds that they're all just as controlled. You could opt to cut yourself off from every aspect of popular culture whatsoever and live a life completely devoid of all of that. Go and live in a cabin in the woods or something if you choose to do that. I choose to continue listening to what I consider to be good music. It's my contention that once you understand what many of these groups and many of these artists were most likely used for, to further agendas and to change societal attitudes and to have a mind-controlling effect, it has to be said, on large numbers of people. But once you understand what the game was and you gain some comprehension of the methods and the tactics that are used, you stand the chance, if the will is there and if you choose, to not be affected by this stuff anymore, to rise above the mind control and to continue to enjoy the music for music's sake. That's where I'm at. I know a lot of people disagree with that notion, and I've been attacked for taking that stance on many occasions, which is why I say it has to be a matter of personal choice. If you yourself choose to cut yourself off from all this, it's your decision. It's what works for you. I'm choosing what works for me. Everyone else must make their own decision in this regard. But going on to the question of whether these artists are trying to put out positive statements and trying to put some good into the world, I very much doubt it in the case of so many of these bands that we've heard of. I personally don't feel that these artists are trying to put good work into the world. Certainly, many of them put out songs that appear to be conscious and meaningful. I think I touched on this in the last video as well. A good example, as this guy mentioned Freddie Mercury, would be Queen's song Is This the World We Created, which was on the flip side to Radio Gaga. That's an incredibly potent song and it makes some amazing statements. But was it delivered from a place of sincerity, from a group that genuinely wanted to help humanity? I would suggest probably not. There's this aspect at play which I've identified as the disarmament tactic. I talk about it in Musical Truth Volume 2, which is where groups and musicians calculatedly make the people feel that they are on their side, that they're a voice for the regular, population, when really they're not. I think you get odd songs like this put out to create that perception of these groups so that they continue to be trusted, they continue to be followed. You think that they're representing your thoughts and your interests and your views. So many of them appear to be anti-establishment and rebellious and going against the man. This is what the punk and new wave scene was all about, at least in principle. But we come to realise that so many of the musicians from that scene were anything but anti-establishment, but were actually products of the establishment. So I don't really accept that these groups are trying to put good into the world, and I think the songs that appear to be doing that are to put us off our guard and to make these people appear like our friends. There's a lot there, but that's really all I've got to say about that one. Stuart Latham asks, what do you think of Goldfrapp? I saw her live performance at Glastonbury 2017 and was immediately struck on how dark and satanic it all was. Surely not. Both her and the rest of her band looked like they were all dressed up to attend a dark mass satanic ritual, and the big screen behind them was displaying weirdly dark subliminal imagery. Not to mention the big tent in which they were performing looked like a giant demon's face with red eyes staring down at everyone. Just look at the tracks Strict Machine and Any More on YouTube to see for yourself. And his second question was, what's your opinion on a band called Gotye? How do you pronounce that? Gotye. I've really not paid too much attention to that group. He says, I see their official video of the track Somebody That I Used to Know has over 1 billion views on YouTube. It's an okay piece of music, but I wouldn't say it warrants over 1 billion views, and the video is weird with both singers' naked bodies getting covered in triangles. Very strange. Well, I can't be a lot of help on these two, unfortunately, as I'm not familiar with these artists. There's only so much time available for people like me to delve into things and research things, and Goldfrapp and Gotye have not made the grade yet in terms of warranting my time. But I think Stuart has pretty much made his own point with these questions, with the statements that he's put out there. He goes on to say, have you seen the official video for the Scissor Sisters track Invisible Light? There appears to be an original and a clean cut version of this video, but both contain a ton of subliminal imagery and what appears to be a ritual abuse scenario. Well, I did take a quick look at that one online on YouTube, and yes, it's sick as fuck. And all this stuff is in there. It's satanic, it's dark occult, there's mind control programming in there, triggers, all sorts. But to be honest, it's business as usual in the music video game. Just another day at the office. And it's becoming a special event for a music video not to display all this kind of stuff. That would be a newsworthy event. A video comes out where the visuals actually bear some kind of similarity. So he goes on to say, I'd like to hear the directors behind these videos being questioned as to why this imagery is in there. There's only so much you can write off as being arty or fashionable. Absolutely, and there's a further question about this which we'll get to as we progress. That's a very good point. Moving on to Thought Criminal, who got in touch on YouTube to say, which other celebrities besides Paul McCartney do you believe are currently imposters? I'm pretty convinced that Bill Hicks / Alex Jones is another example. Well, I've already addressed that one. I don't go for that theory myself. There's certainly been more than one person to have played the public role of Paul McCartney. Well, the whole McCartney mess becomes an absolute quagmire to trudge into when you try and research all of this. And there's been a lot of infighting and squabbling recently between various high-profile Paul is dead or McCartney researchers. Tina Foster, the proprietor of the Plastic Macca blog site, has a particular stance on what happened. She rejects any notion of the Beatles having been a product of the Tavistock Institute or British military intelligence, and is of the view that they began organically as a source of goodness and upliftment for the world, and that when Paul McCartney was murdered, which is her viewpoint, and replaced by the individual that we know as Fall, or Billy Shears, William Shepherd, that's when the Beatles went down this very dark, evil kind of path and started manipulating via social engineering agendas. Mike Williams of Sage of Quay has a different stance on it. He is of the view that the Beatles were a product of these kind of agencies from the start, and I would tend to go along with that because all the evidence points to this. And when it comes to the circumstances in which Paul McCartney died or did not die in 1966, there's a lot of disagreement and contention there. We actually have no documented verifiable proof that the original Paul did die in 1966. It's actually possible that he may still be around. What I see when I look at photos and video footage of Paul McCartney from over the decades is certainly two, probably more than two, individuals playing the public role of Paul McCartney. What can be said for absolute certain is that there's been more than one guy. So it's not a case of Paul is alive and always has been. It's not the case that the individual we have today is the Paul McCartney that we've always known. At some point, a replacement took place, and at least one individual, and as I say, probably more than one, stepped into that public role. So we've been hoaxed, we've been mugged off, and vast deception has taken place when it comes to the question of who Paul McCartney really is and what may have happened to him. And the only way this kind of psyop could have been pulled off is with the full complicity and cooperation of British military intelligence, particularly when you factor in that Sir Paul was knighted by the Queen. And there's no way, if he was an imposter, that he could have slipped through the net of being investigated by British military intelligence and it wouldn't have been discovered that he wasn't who he says he was. It would have been well known to the intelligence communities exactly who this guy is. Otherwise, none of this could have taken place. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked on that. The question was, are there any other celebrities that you believe are currently imposters? Difficult to say. There are many researchers who will tell you that it wasn't just Paul McCartney that was replaced, but that all the Beatles were. And my mind is already fried enough by the McCartney situation for me to be able to take on any question of the other Beatles being replaced. They may well have been, but somebody else is going to have to address that one, or I'm going to have to do it at a different stage in my life. This guy goes on to ask, do you know if there are any celebs that are privy to your work? Well, as I've related a few times, Van Morrison turned up to a couple of my live presentations in 2016. He was there at the Glastonbury Symposium when I delivered my talk there that year, and he then turned up at another presentation in that area the same year. So he kind of slipped in, took his seat, absorbed the presentation. I've got no idea what he made of it. I've got no idea what capacity he was there in. I have met somebody who says that they recommended to him that he attend one of these talks because he would find the information interesting, but he then slinked off at the end of the presentation. I didn't speak to him, and the organisers of the event said, did you know Van Morrison was in attendance? So that was a bit of a surprise. God only knows what he made of it. A very well-known British music producer got in touch with both Mike Williams, Sage of Quay, my buddy from stateside, and myself last year, 2018, to say that he'd looked at the work of both of us. He was showing a great interest in the things that we were saying. He could corroborate a lot of it from his own personal experience, but a lot of the other stuff was of a great surprise and shock to him. But he says he's gone and done his own research into these things, and most of what we've put out there checks out and can be verified. I went to visit this individual last year, and we had a really good chat, and he gave me some insights into some of the acts that he's worked with over the years, some very big names there. Obviously, this individual doesn't wish to be identified because they still work within the industry. And I gave this person my word that I wouldn't divulge their identity. But I will say it's a very big, very well-known name in the British music scene. We have to leave it at that about the industry. Thought Criminal goes on to ask, Do you think anyone famous will ever use their large platform to drop some truth bombs in an articulate and convincing way that wakes up a ton of people? Or is the system and their MK Ultra Manchurian mind control shit somehow so effective on such an unfathomable level that these celebs have no chance of escaping the programming? Well, I think it's very doubtful that anyone in a household name position would come out and spill the beans on exactly what goes on, because they would know that it spells a death sentence for the individual concerned. I certainly think we saw aspects of that playing out with the likes of George Michael, Prince, probably Michael Jackson. There would have been a few others who did go a little bit off script and, in my opinion, to a certain extent, started to break their programming and retain some of their inherent humanity that is there beneath all these layers of control that they get from the industry. So we saw individuals like that making comments and statements publicly, which you can imagine their industry controllers would not have been too happy about. And we know how it ended for all of them. So I think any onlookers would be well aware that if they came out and made similar statements about things that are being kept from the general public, it will probably turn out the same way for them as well. So you can understand why so few names do come forward. You've had the odd individual in Hollywood that has made a statement here and there, such as Roseanne Barr, Randy Quaid, and a few others. But their careers, don't know if you've noticed, but their careers don't exactly flourish from that point on. That's something else they'd be well aware of course. Another question from this guy: if celebrities are being programmed on a large scale, how do you think this is being done? Well, that just ties into the whole area of trauma-based mind control programming, often done through family situations, often done from early childhood. That's a whole subject area in itself, to be honest, that warrants a whole video of its own. He says, I'm also curious if you've dove into Payday Monsanto's catalogue at all yet. If not, you seriously need to. I promise you he makes the best truth music out there, and he's got music for days. Absolutely. Payday Monsanto is a conscious hip-hop MC. I am familiar with his output. I've featured some of his tracks on previous episodes of my Sound of Freedom conscious music podcast. In terms of the programming, like I said, much of this happens due to the family bloodlines that these people are born into. It's done by way of trauma and satanic ritual abuse, and we see depictions of this in so many music videos where they're telling us what's been done, as we've already discussed. I also think that there are regular artists from more run-of-the-mill backgrounds who are inducted into the industry at the adult stage, so they've not been programmed from childhood. Once they've shown themselves to be assets, to display great skill and talent that the industry controllers feel can be harnessed and turned to their advantage, they get coerced into falling into line at that stage. And that could be done either by way of just the good old-fashioned promise of riches beyond their wildest dreams, huge payoffs in order for them to start playing ball. There's also, of course, the possibility of blackmail and rather unsavoury methods of coercion, which may well go on. Nothing is beyond the sick fucks that run these industries and who they're connected to. Trust me, I would put nothing past them. And as I say, we have many examples of what happens when people don't accept these offers that seem too good to be true. At the very best, your career will flop overnight. At the very worst, some other things could happen to you. Paul Henderson, moving on, says, I'd like to delve into the actual musical techniques used by some of the more accomplished artists back in the day. It seems to me that more time was spent in actual composition, i.e. intros, song presentation, construction, harmonies, etc. I think they used modes a lot more and in general were often more sophisticated in their approach. He says there were definitely people behind the scenes who knew what they were doing and which buttons to press, so to speak, so no reason it can't be done again. I'd also like you to get folk to look at solutions. Who knows, there may be a record company out there waiting to happen. Well, as I alluded to earlier, it seems to me that in the 60s and 70s, the bands themselves had much more creative control over their output and how their recorded music ended up sounding. I think you would have found a lot of these musicians present in the studio with the producers, with the engineers, dictating the overall sound of their output. I think what's happened in more recent years and decades is the producers have had much more control and the artists are just left at their whim, particularly with the advent of digital control methods. You could be so much more created in an organic roots kind of way with analog production methods than is the case with digital electronic production that we have now, where all kinds of sound frequencies and all kinds of electronic elements can be getting put into a recording, maybe without the artist's knowledge that it's even taking place. To my mind, it's not a change for the better that's taken place. You can think of artists whose entire sounds and personas have been shaped by the production of their music, the sound. And a great example of one of these would be Frankie Goes to Hollywood, thinking back to the 1980s. Trevor Horn and his record label ZTT, run alongside the former music journalist Paul Morley, were very much responsible for shaping the way Frankie Goes to Hollywood were perceived in the public. I think there was very little of that band's actual music and actual creative input that made it to the final productions. You can think of records like Two Tribes that came out in all these different 12-inch remixes, and all of them were the creation of Trevor Horn and his engineers, and there was a whole load of hype and propaganda that went with it at the hands of Paul Morley to actually market the things as well. I would suggest that the members of Frankie Goes to Hollywood were very much in the background and very much slaves to what had been decided for them on their behalf. And we think of this sound that Frankie Goes to Hollywood had, but it wasn't really that group at all. It was all the marketing platform and the production platform that had been created for them. So that's the level of power that the production stage can have in a group's career. The current so-called hip-hop scene is another example of this aspect in action as well, where you've got auto-tune everywhere, you've got all these demonic sonics, as I refer to them as, just this garbage, satanic production sound, all these bass lines with discordant, dissonant sound frequencies being put in there. And again, the artists are largely irrelevant, if you can even call them artists. You just get some clown, some goon to come and spit a few nonsense mumble bloody lyrics, and the rest of the production is handled in the studio by the producer, by the engineer, by the record company, and then you just stick one of these clowns out front to try and market it, but they're not really having any creative control over their output at all. So the whole game has changed in that regard, and the same could be said of all these pop puppets now, these manufactured stooges that are just dancing to the tune of whatever the record company behind them decides is going to be the order of the day. All right, back to a question from Eileen Sweeney of Braintree in Massachusetts. Have you noticed these Americans are always stealing our town names? You need to come up with your own names, guys. Really, come on now. Just playing. Okay, she says, would you please speak about the role of band groupies such as Anita Pallenberg, Marianne Faithfull, Pamela Courson, Nancy Spungen, Paula Yates, Courtney Love, etc.? So we already mentioned Pamela Courson and Courtney Love, of course. She says, the placement of these groupies in key bands of their day always seemed odd to me, and to think about the fact that they were, sorry to say, passed around from band member to band member or from one band to another usually makes me feel a little sick. Would you say there's something organised to their involvement with various band members and the related band's popularity? Well, what springs to mind with this question is very much the case of Anita Pallenberg and Marianne Faithfull and their placement within the Rolling Stones camp. So they were both girlfriends of various members of the Stones. And as Eileen says here, they seem to have been passed around rather like rag dolls. You hear that both of them were at one point or another girlfriends of Brian Jones, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, paging in and paging out like some kind of tag team. Their role was never really clear. They were just kind of groupies, hangers-on. Marianne Faithfull appeared in the Kenneth Anger movie Lucifer Rising. Kenneth Anger was a satanic filmmaker very much connected to the Rolling Stones, but you never really knew what these people did beyond that. So again, we can look at some backgrounds of these people. Marianne Faithfull in particular becomes very interesting. Her mother, Eva, was the daughter of an Austro-Hungarian nobleman, Arthur Wolfgang Ritter von Sacher-Masoch, living from 1875 to 1953, and it's from that family that we get the term masochism, as in sadomasochism. If I ever got the chance to get close to any of these celebrities, but I won't, because they won't touch the likes of me with a 6-foot barge pole. They don't want to run the risk of anyone asking any kind of question that goes off script and goes outside of what these artists are supposed to talk about. Their latest album, who they're collaborating with, where they're going on tour, blah, 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 all the official press release stuff. So tried and trusted journalists turn up to these press conferences and you'll never hear one of them saying, why is there occult symbolism in your video? Why are you promoting trauma-based mind control and child sexual abuse? For the most part, these journalists, these representatives wouldn't be aware of any of this stuff anyway. But even if they were, and if one of these questions did slip through the net and got asked at one of these events, watch how quickly it gets shut down. Watch how quickly that individual never gets to ask that kind of question again, probably never gets to work for that organisation again. And of course, the thing would never be made public. They would never put out the video of that press conference. They would never publish an article where that question was included. These things are closely controlled so that only the tried and trusted ones who behave themselves and who are part of the industry machinery get into those kind of positions. That's the way that dynamic works. I think we're pretty much at the end in terms of what I'm going to do in this video. Once again, I want to thank everyone for sending in the questions. I'll do another one maybe around April, in about 3 months' time from now. So if anyone wants to get any questions in for that, you can leave them on the YouTube page of this video if you want to do that. If you want to send them to me via Facebook, if you'll me a direct email to markdevlinuk@gmail.com. So once again, that's markdevlinuk@gmail.com. Pose any question you would like, anything you'd like me to address, and I'll get round to as many as I can next time round, as well as the few that I've had to hold over from this time that I've just not had time to go into. And please just bear in mind the point that I made at the start of the video, which is what we need more of is people undertaking this kind of research off their own back and then bringing it to everyone else and pooling all this information, all this knowledge, so that all of us can understand better the degree to which we've been hoaxed and deceived by the entertainment industry and the forces that control it for so long. It's incredible that we're now able to understand things like revelation of the method, the way secret societies and Freemasonry works, whereby they feel the need to tell you certain things about what they're doing. They do it cryptically, they do it in encoded form, but nevertheless, we've got the opportunity to know. For all these decades, they've been viewing regular members of society like us as profane, as not deserving of being privy to their kind of knowledge, their kind of occulted information. But you know what? We're reversing that process every single day now, because we're getting to know things that we were never supposed to know. And that's only going to continue, that's only going to grow exponentially. And all of us can be a part of that process. And we need to keep it moving. Marianne Faithfull's maternal great-great-uncle was Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, and his erotic novel Venus in Furs spawned the word masochism, so that's where it came from. Marianne Faithfull's maternal grandmother was Jewish. Her father, Major Robert Glyn Faithfull, was a British intelligence officer. Would you believe? So here the question re-emerges once again. What is someone coming out of nobility and the military intelligence community doing, hanging out with rock bands, doing drugs, shagging rock stars? Is that a natural outcome for somebody from that kind of background left to their own devices? Or is it more likely that this person is fulfilling a role, and them being in that kind of situation is no accidental random thing? It's planned for. Anita Pallenberg, got some stuff on her. Thought I did anyway. No, I don't have it to hand, but Anita Pallenberg, people can look up her background and find out what she was all about. So, more on Marianne Faithfull. After brief sexual dalliances with Brian Jones and Keith Richards, this is taken from my Musical Truth Volume 1 book, she eventually left her husband, John Dunbar, who was one of the co-founders of the Indica Gallery in London, this highly influential institution that was part of the avant-garde counterculture scene of 1960s London. And this is the place where John Lennon and Yoko Ono are said to have met for the first time after being introduced by Paul McCartney on the 11th of September 1966, 9/11/66. Go figure. Marianne Faithfull began a 4-year relationship with Mick Jagger in 1966, and it's said that she was fascinated by the occult, and she was briefly involved with the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which has links to all kinds of people like Charles Manson, Sirhan Sirhan, Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan, and all this stuff. For a while also, it seems, Marianne Faithfull was romantically linked to Ian Copeland, who comes from the Copeland CIA family. I think I addressed this lot in the last video as well. It's from the Copelands that we get the group The Police, and that family was hugely influential in the whole punk and new wave scene, having major control over many of the prominent artists coming out of that particular movement. So there's connections for days, as always, and it just raises the question of who these people really are, where they came from, and therefore what groups like the Rolling Stones are really all about. G.S. Finlayson says, I've been a fan of Mark Knopfler since 1980 and all his work with, of course, Dire Straits and his subsequent solo material. It appears Mark genuinely battled his way into the music industry, not forming Dire Straits until he was in his late 20s and just about scraping together the money to fund the initial demo tape, which first aired on Charlie Gillette's radio show. However, by the mid to late 80s, Dire Straits were the biggest band in the world, and Mark was appearing with all the usual suspects, including Paul McCartney, William Shepherd, Elton John and Eric Clapton, to name a few, along with regular appearances for the Prince's Trust concerts, and of course, a key slot in the Live Aid concert of 1985 at the hands of Bob Geldof. Since disbanding Dire Straits, however, Mark has gone back to releasing more low-key solo material recorded in his own Grove studios and released on his Grove record label. Do you think he was hijacked by the establishment and Illuminati dark side of the music industry during the Dire Straits days, but somehow managed to escape? Or do you think he was never a part of it, or is indeed still a part of it? Well, I can only speculate on this one because I don't have a great deal of personal knowledge of Mark Knopfler and Dire Straits. They were never really my cup of tea. But when the lifetime actors like Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney, Elton John, and these people just go on and on and on, it seems like many of the chosen ones come with a sell-by date in terms of being a household name. So while Mark Knopfler was up there with the aforementioned on the Live Aid lineup, and Brothers in Arms was really big news in 1985. They were the biggest rock band, heavily involved in MTV and all of that. It does seem like he kind of faded back into relative obscurity in the subsequent years. So this seems to be a play out of certain artists who are selected as useful assets of the industry for a certain period. They play their role, they fulfill whatever's required of them, and then, in my view, they're allowed to kind of quietly fade into the background and make the kind of music they want to make, as long as it doesn't really rock the boat, as long as it doesn't reveal great secrets, as long as it doesn't stray too far from what these celebrities are really used for. So they'll be given a certain degree of artistic freedom, as long as, for the most part, they continue, towing the line and not causing any problems. And I think probably that's what we've seen with Mark Knopfler, Dire Straits. That's what we've seen with many of these groups who have nowhere near the public profile now that they used to back in the day, but they're still making music, they're still doing shows, they're still putting out albums, and it's really just the hardcore fan base that's following what they do now. They're not being lapped up by the fashionistas and the kids of today. Hope that answers that one. Gonna go for about 2 or 3 more, and then we'll call it a day for this video. All the others will have to get held over to the next one. Try and keep these as brief as possible. Been going for what? Ooh, over an hour now. All right, we'll do a couple more. So another one on YouTube from somebody called Sure Thing Pat, who says, can I ask you a question for your next Q&A? What are your thoughts on the recent death of Dolores O'Riordan? And he says, I found a picture of Dolores doing the one eye sign in Google Images. Absolutely. There's a sign of her giving it this, as all the others do. And there's a sign of her with newly dyed peroxide blonde, closely cropped hair. This comes up in research into mind control programming. I've mentioned it before. Vigilant Citizen has some articles on this as well. The symbolic significance of artists that turn up with peroxide blonde dyed hair at a particular point in their career. That's worth looking into. And this person also asks about Freddie Mercury and Queen, who he says are one of the most Illuminati of all groups. Certainly one way of looking at it. Dolores O'Riordan death is extremely suspect. She was yet another to have been found in a bathtub in a hotel, January 2018, in the Hilton Park Lane Hotel in London. Initially, we were told that the police didn't suspect any kind of foul play, and it was inferred that she'd taken some kind of overdose, and it was all at her own hand, and there was no reason to suspect anything else went on. The autopsy report was held off for many, many months, and it wasn't until towards the end of last year, 2018, that we got the news that she'd been discovered in a bathtub. And again, this was put down to some kind of undisclosed substance overdose. There are connections here to people like Whitney Houston, who was found in a bathtub, her daughter Bobby Christina, Jim Morrison was discovered in a bathtub reportedly, we covered that one earlier, and then many artists who turn up dead in hotel rooms. Whitney Houston, Chris Cornell in a Detroit hotel room, Michael Hutchence in a Sydney hotel room, and now Dolores O'Riordan. With Michael Hutchence and Chris Cornell, we have stories from family and friends, people close to them, saying that directly before they were discovered dead, they seemed in good spirits and they were making plans for the future, the short-term future. So they had plans for the coming days, the coming weeks. And they didn't display signs of wanting to take their own life. So often with these unexplained artist deaths, it's left to the public to just kind of chalk it up as, oh, well, maybe they just get tired of living, or maybe they're just really irresponsible and they're doing drugs, they're doing alcohol, they're doing prescription drugs, and they overdose on these things and it's just a tragic accident. There's a lot of reliance on these things being chalked up as one of these instances. But it really raises so many questions when these artists are making plans for the future and they seem to be people that want to continue living. Are they really then going to be that irresponsible to take some kind of overdose that claims their life? More questions than answers with Dolores then, particularly when you factor in some aspects of her background. She's one of so many artists that has talked about having been sexually abused in childhood. This brings in trauma-based mind control again and satanic ritual abuse and all this. And she's also stated that she battled mental illness. She had bipolar. So many artists are stating that they've got mental health conditions. Why would that be? Why are so many of these artists prone to this if the industry is all about fun and entertainment and all is good in the hood? Regarding Queen then, the group which this guy asked about, they're another band with unlikely posh backgrounds. So they all came out of Ealing Art College, which is where they were formed, very similar to Pink Floyd and Genesis and groups like this. The kind of background that you wouldn't necessarily expect would lead to a rock group. Brian May, who looks like he's the reincarnation of Sir Isaac Newton, is of course a prominent physicist, and he's now a CBE, another commander of the Order of the British Empire. So he must have been doing something right. The establishment have decided that they like him. Freddie designed the very occultic coat of arms for the group Queen, which you can take a look at online. The group's song One Vision, when you look at the lyrics, kind of sound like a bit of a New World Order, One World Government manifesto in terms of what it's putting forward. That emerged in the wake of the Live Aid concert, which gave that group a real career resurgence in 1985, shortly before we discovered Freddie Mercury had become ill from AIDS and was in fact dying of it, and he ended up passing away in October 1991. Whether there's any foul play to that, I don't know. It could just be a result of his decadent lifestyle catching up with him. Who knows? It's been pointing out, though, how spine-tinglingly prophetic the line from Bohemian Rhapsody is, given how Freddie ended up. We get the line, "Too late, my time has come, sent shivers down my spine, body aching all the time. Goodbye, everybody, I've got to go, got to leave you all behind and face the truth." Pretty potent in the circumstances, right? I think we'll make this the final one because we've been going for about an hour and 20 minutes now. The other questions I'll hold over until I do the next session, probably in 2 or 3 months from now. This one comes from Matt. No further information. This guy emailed me and he says, in all these years, so this is going back to a question which was alluded to earlier in the session. In all these years, why hasn't anyone directly asked all these celebrities and directors and producers just what they're doing, including so much Illuminati symbolism in their work? Like, hey, Bono or Lady Gaga or Madonna, why did you put your hand over your eye in that shot? Why did you actually just do that? Or, hey, director, why is your crap music video filled with pyramids? Who told you to do that? Why is everybody giving it this? Why is everybody doing that? What's the reason? Well, the reason why directors don't get called out on this type of shit is mainly because only approved journalists can get near them. They do interview sessions, they do press conferences, but the only people that are allowed to attend and ask questions are journalists or representatives of approved publications or TV or radio stations. So I know this from my days of having done a radio show on Galaxy 101 back in the day. I used to get the opportunity to go up to London and meet prominent R&B and hip-hop artists. So I met Destiny's Child when they first came out, and I sat next to Beyonce on a sofa in 1998, which is never ever going to happen again. I'm never going to be in the same city as her again, probably, let alone sat next to her on a sofa. But back then, because I was approved and I was a representative of this tried and trusted radio station, I was granted access to the group to ask a bunch of questions. Of course, back in 1998, I was completely mind controlled, in the matrix, behaving myself, doing what radio journalists and presenters are supposed to do, and I didn't know any of the stuff that I currently talk about. So there was no danger of me asking any remotely challenging or unorthodox question. These days, I would